1 week until the US election. I wanted to offer an update based on my analysis from 3 weeks ago. What is the state of the current presidential race? In short, nothing has fundamentally changed in 3 weeks. As a result, my analysis remains intact. This is a battle that will be determined in the 7 swing states. All of these swing states, current polls indicate, are within the margin of error. They're pure toss-ups. We can also add that this has been a historically tight race, not only in terms of the narrow gap in the swing states, but the lack of big fluctuations. Ever since Kamala Harris has gotten into the race, she's retained a slim national lead. So the keys remain the same. The winner of Pennsylvania is going to be very determinative of the winner. A lot of pollsters put an 80% or greater likelihood the winner of Pennsylvania will win the general election. It's also a question of demographics. Most pollsters are finding a record gender gap between men and women. And this also carries over to blue collar men. In 2016, they abandoned Hillary Clinton, the first female presidential candidate. In 2020, many of these voters returned to Biden. What will they do in this current election? There's also indication that Trump, who's run 2 previous times, is making bigger gains with male minority voters, particularly Hispanic and potentially African American voters as well. So that's going to be a key determinant to the outcome of especially the Sun Belt states. Of course, another big determinant, as I mentioned 3 weeks ago, is enthusiasm and turnout. Kamala Harris really created enthusiasm in the Democratic ranks. On the other hand, Trump has historically also generated large turnout among low propensity voters. So we don't know how those forces are going to manifest or potentially cancel themselves out this time. We examined the presidential polling over the last 2 to 3 weeks. The polls seem to indicate a narrowing of the gap, Trump gaining ground on Harris. After the first and only presidential debate, Harris opened up about a 3% national gap, and most polls indicate that this has narrowed to less than percent. So it's essentially a statistical dead heat on the national level. And in terms of the swing states, we see that Trump has an edge in many of the polls, but all of them remain within the margin of error. There's an intense interest in this race because of its historic significance. I watch a number of pundits who have a lot of history either participating in recent presidential elections or being professional pollsters or both. So some of the pundits I look at are, of course, Nate Silver, who's had a great record. You might also know Professor Alan Lichtman, who has been the famous Nostradamus, who has his 9 keys that he uses to determine the victor. What we see among all the pundits, with the exception perhaps of Mark Halperin, who's pretty confident that Trump will win, is that they all express the idea that the vote is very close. There are people like Simon Rosenberg and James Carville that just reading the tea leaves based on their instinct, they believe that Harris has the lead. Most of the people that are pure pollsters, including Karl Rove and Frank Luntz, really believe that the election is way too close to call. The polls are all over the map. They're within a statistical margin. So they have no idea how it will break. But they generally believe that probably in the end, there's going to be a swing one way or another. There's certainly been a record number of polls conducted this election cycle. And they all indicate a very close race. There's still a lot of speculation, however, that despite how close the polls suggest the race is, the polls may be wrong, and that one candidate might win by a significant, electoral college margin. Now, one reason for that is that polls are simply that. They're a sounding board, and they're based upon modeling. In particular, they're trying to figure out, who is going to be the likely voter. They're based on models based on registration, and registration is often done on the basis of party affiliation. So, relatively small assumptions can create very different results and big swings in various polls. A lot of the polls created this cycle are looking back to 2020 as kind of the default model in terms of who is likely to show up. But that is actually, in my view, a very faulty premise because this is a completely different race. It's a gendered race. It's also a race where, many women after the Dobbs decision are very motivated to come to the polls. So I think models that are based on what happened in 2020 are likely to be off. Now, traditionally, Trump has outperformed his polls. This was true in 2016, where he kind of surprised most pollers. And it was even true in 2020, where he lost the election but outperformed his polls. So this leads many Republicans to be optimistic that, again, the Trump effect will manifest. And if he's actually tied in the national polls, it means he's going for a blowout election. But history suggests something else. Since the Dobbs decision and the Supreme Court's throwing out of Roe v. Wade, essentially what we see is that Democrats dramatically outperform the polls. We should also point out that Trump is not historically a winning candidate. Not only did he lose in 2020 and the midterms in 2018 and 2022, in a way, it was kind of a fluke that he won in 2016. It was really extraordinary events, including the Comey intervention that swung the election late towards his side. He has never managed to gain more than 47% of the popular vote. And if he's going to win the election, he's going to need to outperform his historic levels of support. Looking back over American electoral history, we see this record of late shifts. In the last 2 weeks, the undecided voters tend to swing one way or the other. We saw this in Obama's case in 2008, where the polls showed a relatively tight race, and then he ended up winning decisively. We also saw this in Trump's victory in 2016 after the Comey intervention. There was a decisive shift towards Trump late. So, do the polls indicate any late break this election? Simon Rosenberg has talked a lot about the so-called red wave polls. These are essentially Republican polls or polls from think tanks, which don't have a lot of record. They're partisan. And he argues that this is part of a conscious strategy to essentially skew the averages, aggregators like Real Clear Politics that take all the polls. They're presenting the impression that somehow there's a late momentum for Trump when this is in fact not true. If you look at the reliable polls, what he argues is that the race is remarkably consistent. Now, I think that's a pretty valid argument because there is some indication that these polls are either not scientific or they're being used for this purpose. We also saw this playing out in 2022. But I don't fully buy the argument because even if we look at the so called reliable polls like the Times Siena poll, we see that the race is narrowing. This might be an indication that Trump is gaining among undecided voters, that they may have significant reservations about his character, but they believe he can better handle the economy, and therefore they're swaying towards him. On the other hand, if you look at the last 3 weeks, Trump's behavior has been very erratic. He's had tremendous struggles even responding to basic questions. He calls his senior moments the weave, as if somehow it's a genius thing to make these strange connections between ideas that have no logical coherence. I think for a candidate that's ending with kind of controversy and has these senior moments, I just don't know if that can be the basis for a late swing or not. So, who are the undecideds at this point? It's 1 minute before casting their ballot, but there is a lot of indication that there are still these undecided voters. So, who are these voters? Generally speaking, they skew younger, and there's a question of whether they will turn up at all. Generally speaking, older voters turn out in larger numbers. Generally speaking, if young voters turn out, the Democrats do better. Generally speaking, these voters are more independent rather than having a party identification. They might be low propensity or less regular voters. They're undecided because they're low information voters. They don't pay a lot of attention to politics. There's some indication that a lot of these voters are skewing towards minority, working class, and female. And they're still trying to make up their mind. It's kind of the choice of two candidates that they don't feel very strongly about. They're conflicted about it, and this is why they're undecided. Typically, what you see in elections is with these undecided voters, as I said, they kind of swing to one way or the other. What we tend to find out after the fact is that there's a certain ballot question which ultimately determines what they decide. Harris and Trump are making different arguments, and whatever metric they use will then shape the choice that they make. If they are basically making an economic argument, they tend to trust Trump more on the economy. This will lead them to swing towards Trump. If they're more concerned about democracy or abortion or instability, and those type of arguments are on their mind when they go to the ballot box, they will swing towards Harris. So during the last week of a U.S. election, there's really no polling that's done anymore. Both candidates essentially make their closing arguments. It's all about, turnout essentially. So Harris is going to speak today. She's going to go to Ellipsis in the Capitol to basically remind voters about January 6th and Trump's ability or attempt to overturn the U.S. Election. So she's kind of making several different arguments. I think she's trying to appeal to different people, different demographics for different reasons. She's arguing that Trump is a danger to democracy. They really pivoted on the John Kelly arguments and the kind of unsavory things that Trump said about Nazism and the danger that he presents to the country. There's also a lot of arguments that Trump is unhinged, that he's losing his marbles, that he's old, and certainly this was a major concern for voters when Biden was in the race, and now of course Trump is the old candidate and struggling cognitively to keep his sentences straight. She's trying to make the argument, I'm for you, and he's all about himself. This certainly plays to a perception in voters' mind. Essentially, she's trying to argue that Trump is a morally repugnant person, too unstable to trust with the office. If she's able to sway voters with that argument, I think they would agree with most voters would agree with their assessment about Trump. But Trump is making a different argument. It's basically arguing about the economy. Now, there was a lot of controversy, just a couple days ago when Trump had this Madison Square Garden rally, which really brought to my mind again memories of the Nazi Party of America's rally in 1939. But they essentially Trump is not closing, from my point of view, strong and harming the economic arguments. That would be the orthodox political approach. I think, though, that we would be underestimating Trump if we argue that he's just simply incoherent. I think this is part of a conscious strategy. So, this comedian came on and made this, inflammatory remark that Puerto Rico is an island of garbage, which, according to traditional calculus, is a great mistake. You don't want to be, offending voting blocks, particularly voting blocks that you were appealing to and that could be critical to your victory on November 5. In particular, there's over 300,000 Puerto Ricans that live in Pennsylvania, which is essentially the keystone state for the whole election. So, on the surface, this seems like a very odd strategy, and perhaps it's a mistake because the Trump campaign is known to be very corrupt and very ineffective. But my assessment is that, there's no way that this comedian just went on stage and said these things. These things are vetted. They are consciously doing this because it's the Trump playbook. They're trying to wage the culture wars. They're trying to build on these resentments, and they're trying to drive out their vote. And historically, in both 2016 and 2020 election he lost, this worked. On the other side, he's got these other very radical things that he's increasingly talking about, deporting 6 million illegal aliens, calling his political enemies enemy within, insinuating that he's going to imprison Michelle Obama. The economic arguments, the traditional Republican arguments, are kind of lost to the side. He was kind of mixing those in previous elections. Now he's really going full MAGA. In my personal view, I don't think that's a good strategy because I think it plays into Harris's arguments, but we'll see whether it works to him. I don't think it's a mistake. I think it is a conscious decision. I think it's a bad decision, but we'll see whether he was right in his calculation. Now, the US election is going to be on November 5, but millions of Americans have already voted, over 30 million at last count, and this is going to go up to election date. So, what can we glean from the tea leaves in terms of the early vote and what's happening? Certain states, they have data in terms of whether it's a Republican voter or a Democratic voter or independent that voted. There's also data on potentially your ethnicity, so you might be able to judge how many women showed up or how many African Americans voted in Detroit, and you might be able to use that data to get a picture of how the electorate is feeling and to kind of predict the election. One of the things we can see looking at the early voting data is that the Republicans are returning to early voting. They used to be the masters of it. Their turnout machine was the envy of the Democrats. And then in 2020, Trump blew that up and said that, mail-in ballots were, essentially fraudulent. You had to show up on election day, which was a big mistake. So he recognized that mistake, and now he's urging people to vote early. So we shouldn't be surprised that there's more Republicans voting early this election than they did in 2020. Now, when someone votes early, does it really mean anything? If they could vote on election day, they could vote early. From a campaign point of view, there is a difference because you want your vote to show up early so that you can focus your efforts on turning out the low propensity voters. So that's an advantage to you. But in terms of the early voting data that I've seen, most of the Republican voters that are voting early were people that regularly voted, so they're simply cannibalizing their vote. Now, if we look at two states, Michigan and Nevada, they're kind of sending different signals. In terms of Nevada, the Republican early votes suggest that they're much stronger than they have traditionally been. The Democrats have won Nevada 4 straight presidential elections, so that might be a sign of concern. On the other hand, in Michigan, the turnout in Detroit among African voters is very, very high, which is a good sign for the Democrats. Now, generally, if we look at the swing state, what we can see at a very broad level is that a lot of the early votes are women, they're older voters, and minority voters are coming out in higher numbers than they did before. Does it mean anything? There's definitely a record amount of turnout in all these states like North Carolina. But I would say in the final analysis that this data is not conclusive. The only thing you could maybe conclude is we are probably heading to a higher turnout election. And generally speaking, I think higher turnout elections mean that Democrats win because traditionally the Democratic Party is larger. But some of that gap has narrowed as well in the last 8 years. So I have no idea who's going to win the election, but we can say what is going to determine the outcome. It's really a turnout game, and this is what we call the ground game. It's the ability of the party to turn up their supporters. In the United States, generally speaking, 50% of people actually head to the polls. So the party that can get more of their supporters or partisans to show up tends to win the election. Now, in this election, there's a lot of talk about the Democrats having a superior ground game. And I think that is true in general. So the Democratic ground game, what this essentially means, it's a traditional model, is essentially to set up party headquarters. And the Democratic machine, even before Kamala became the candidate under Joe Biden, was setting up party headquarters in all the swing states. Even a year before November 5, and they began the process of building up their party machine, which is, essentially recruiting a lot of volunteers. And what these volunteers will do is, knock on doors, register voters. They will also call voters to remind them to vote, to verify that they vote. Because the Democrats have a lot of money and invested a lot in the machine, they have a better turnout machine. That means that they, demonstratedly are contacting voters at a much higher rate than the Republicans. They know who the voters are. They know who they have to turn out. And they even have the luxury of doing deep canvassing, which means that they not only try to figure out voters' intentions, but they can go to the door and try to persuade voters. They know what the issues are and try to get them to the polls. Now, the Republicans didn't invest in a turnout machine. In fact, Trump ordered the party, the Republican National Party, to instead focus on scrutineers to prevent so-called voter fraud, which is just a kind of a weird sort of thing and a big strategic mistake that may cost him big in the election. We'll see. On the other hand, I don't think that the Republicans are as doomed as you might suggest. There's no doubt about it that they do not have this centralized model that the Democrats do. They don't have the resources. They're not hitting as many doors. He essentially outsourced his operation to a bunch of wealthy billionaires, Charlie Kirk's Turning Point, Elon Musk's PAC, and there's already indication from people on the ground in Pennsylvania and Georgia that, where are these guys? And, there's reports that a lot of this data is fraud. I mean, building a political machine requires expertise. You just can't, parachute in a millionaire and expect it to fundamentally work. On the other hand, I think, the Republicans do have a kind of a different strategy. Theirs is based kind of on the captain model. So they have, captains, surfacing in various states, and their job is to be in contact with 50 voters, keep in touch with them, and bring them to the polls. And, Karl Rove used that model in 2004. It can be effective. I have no idea to gauge how effective it is this time. I think the one thing that's been very effective for Trump and that people or Democrats discount is that he is very effective at the digital strategy using targeted internet ads. He's got very good data on the type of prejudices of various voters. And, he creates ads like this one. I was watching a Lions game a couple weeks ago, and half the, ads during the game, half the commercials during the game were the same ad featuring transvestites and this kind of punchline, she's for them, Trump's for you. So, I have no idea to what extent that type of argument resonates. I mean, certainly among educated Republicans, that type of wedge issue is not going to work. But this is the type of thing that he did before. I mean, Hillary Clinton very much outspent Trump in 2016, and his voters turned up. And I wouldn't discount the power of his digital media in terms of driving up his voter profile. On the other hand, in the final analysis, Stacey Abrams and Georgia, I gotta believe that the Democrats have a lot of money. They've got a lot of organization. There's very smart people. They're getting out the early vote. They're going to be able to focus on those low propensity voters. They're going to play up a lot of Trump's mistakes over this last week. I would have to think that the Democrats have a better structure to drive their voters to the polls. There's more voters that are Democratic than Republican, even in most swing states. So I would have to say that the Democrats do have an advantage. Now, if you tune into the major media outlets to watch the election, it's probably likely that on November 5, you won't know before you go to bed, unless you do an all-nighter, who the victor will be. One of the reasons is many of the states, there's so much early voting, and there's a lot of states which are not allowed to count those ballots until actual election day. So that's going to come in the next morning. If the vote is decided early, um, if it will probably be there's kind of two indicator states. If North Carolina is Democratic, we can be certain that Kamala Harris wins the election, and the same goes for Pennsylvania. If Pennsylvania declares for Trump, we can be pretty certain that Trump is going to win. I don't think that's going to happen in either case. I think we're going to have to look deeper. And perhaps if you want to have a good night's sleep, there's certain indicator counties that you can look at. So Pennsylvania is very important. Erie County in the northwest on the Ohio border, Allegheny County, the old steel area that used to be a Democratic area, but it's been drifting Republican. I mean, I think those are good indicator counties. Biden won those counties narrowly, but he was a native son. He was a white male. If Kamala Harris is underperforming in those counties, that could be a bad sign for her in Pennsylvania, where she could potentially still win it, but it'd be a bad sign for her in the Rust Belt states. It means that perhaps because of her gender, because of her being labeled as a radical Marxist, the white working class vote really turned against her in a major way. Another thing I'll be looking at is the so-called collar suburbs or inner suburbs that tend to be very wealthy and white. This was traditionally the Republican base under Bush and earlier candidates, but they are very allergic to Trumpism. The mayor of Waukesha County, one of the most you know red Republican districts, said he was voting for Kamala Harris. This is the degree to which Republicans, evangelicals, women upset about abortion are really turning against the Republican Party in a major way. So one of the things that Kamala Harris has tried to do by campaigning with Liz Cheney is to appeal to the Nikki Haley voters. For example, when Nikki Haley dropped out of the race in Pennsylvania during the primaries, 10% of Republicans voted for her, which suggests that 10% of Republicans are available to Harris. They may choose not to vote for her or just vote for a third candidate or not vote at all. But if she can win them over, that would be a historic margin, a swing of these, collar suburbs towards the Democratic camp. And a lot of these inner suburbs have very large populations compared to the rural vote that Trump is appealing to. So there's some indication that these Republicans kind of turned their nose either in the first or the second Trump election and voted Republican because they're traditionally Republicans. But in this particular election, especially with how radical Trump has been and how incognitant he's been in terms of expressing his ideas, that they may be swinging in ways towards the Democratic side that the models simply couldn't predict. And this would result in, if this phenomenon is there, and we can look at these counties like Kent County, Michigan, if these old Republicans are swinging towards Kamala Harris in large margins, it suggests that she's going to win the election. And generally speaking, if we go to the metropolitan regions, there's a strong urban-rural divide. If turnout is large in these metropolitan regions where the population is, that's also a strong indicator that Kamala Harris and the Democrats are going to win the presidential election. Now, a lot of pundits are looking at this election as kind of a horse race between two candidates and two philosophies and dramatizing it. But if you look at Trump's career, he really is a fascist in the sense that it's never about the election, it's about seizing power. And what we can see in history is that fascists who attempt coups sometimes don't succeed on the first time. But what they work at is, kind of weakening the democratic institutions and practices within to create conditions for a violent takeover of power. So already in 2016, when he believed he was going to lose the election, Trump was playing the fraud claims. And of course, once he won the election, that just went away. During 2020, we saw various schemes he used to take over the country. I'm not going to go into detail on those because that was part of my earlier analysis. What we see from the Republicans this time is more of the same, trying to manipulate the way the ballots are counted at the local level in places like Michigan and Georgia. They're putting into place a lot of scrutineers, already appealing to his followers that there's no way they can win. All the polls show that they're going to win by a landslide. So the only way that they can lose is by fraud and that their supporters should take up arms. And if you look at the polling that was done by Ipsos, it's very scary. Essentially, 30% of Republicans believe that violence is going to be necessary, potentially necessary in order to get their voice heard. Uh, Trump, Tucker Carlson a couple days ago were really inciting these arguments not to accept the outcome of the election to seize power. So in a way, what happens on election night doesn't matter. No matter what, Trump is going to contest the election, and the fate of the country is going to be determined in what happens after the election, not on who cast the most votes.